So good morning, everybody. So I'm extremely happy to see you all here. Sorry it took us a while to get prepared, but so my name is Lyudmila Alyabieva. I am director of PhD program in art and design here at Art and Design School, Higher School of Economics, and this is our first individual, independent conference. So please bear that in mind. And I'm extremely happy to see my colleagues from different countries here and our colleagues from Russia who are here with us. So you can see how long, big, and beautiful the program is. And of course, I would love to listen to every presentation myself. Hopefully, I will be able to do that. So just a few words. So you see, we have 3 days. 2 days will be located here. So we are going to stay here. But this evening, tonight, those who are interested in Esther Chalev-Gertz, our guest from France, artist, I guess you all know her work. So she will be giving an artist talk at the Jewish Museum. So those who are interested, you can go after the sections, after the panels are over. Tomorrow we'll stay here all the time. And on the 12th of April, we have whole day at Electro Theatre Stanislavski because it will be Performance Studies Day. So we'll have a combination of academic talks, roundtables, and also performances. So you're welcome. And I'd like to now so just give word to Deputy Dean of the whole High School of Economics, and ТАТЬЯНА РИВЧУН will say a few words, and she will also be moderating this first panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'm glad to see you here in the building of the HSC Art and Design School. Very briefly, Lyudmila, by the way, is not only the head of the PhD program, but she's also the organizer of the conference, and not only of the conference, but a lot of activities connected with the research, connected with fashion, and she's doing a lot of work. So this is, in a way, we are sitting here because she made a great work. So now a few words. Lyudmila said that we are independent. In a way, this year we are starting the first time the conference in our building here in the Art and Design School. In general, we are not independent. I mean, we are part of the High School of Economics. We are part of the Faculty of Communication, Media and Design, and we are happy to be part of all of this. Because I think that nowadays integration of everything is very important. And today, and during all these 3 days, I think that we have a very interesting program. And we have a lot of very detailed questions which we have to answer and to listen to. But in general, when we started two years ago, when we started the research program in Art and Design School, we were asking ourselves, what are we going to do? And what questions are we going to answer? And what message are we going to give to the world? And so it is quite interesting what we asked ourselves and what we answered. We don't want to be the normal PhD program which is doing the normal classical works. We want to be within the context of today, and the context is changing very rapidly. And the context is really so dependent on the many things, and of course it's dependent on the technologies, because technologies are developing. And if 10 years ago education was absolutely independent from research, now it's difficult to say where is the end and where is the edge of education, research, where is the edge between art and not art. And I think that in general now it is the time of very strange edges, because the edges sometimes appear in the places where they shouldn't appear and disappear where we want to find them. And so this is, in a way, is also one of the problems which we are trying to, in our school, to research, because I think it is also, independently from separate topics, it's very interesting to understand And why it is important? Because we are the university, and now we, in the Art and Design School, we have 2,000 students, and not all of them are doing research. In our PhD program, there are at the moment only 30 students, even 21 students. But we are only the second year, we are existing only for the second year. But in general, the research is part of the education in our school. And I hope that during all these 3 days, and Ludmila said that we will have different spaces for our conference, and it was also one of the ideas when we started that research shouldn't be in one place and performance should be in the other place. We, from the beginning, decided that it will be in the same place mentally and in the same place sometimes physically. And so this is also one of the principles of our research school.
So Sarah, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and for coming here. It's a great honor for us that you are going to open our conference. And Sarah is going to speak on culture and emigration, crowds and power. Sarah Wilson, KURTO, Institute of Art, London University. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is as much fashion as you are going to get this morning, because this is my own personal anti-Brexit outfit for the demonstration in Parliament Square with my friend Adrien Sina, who made this superb poster, which, as you can see, puts the X of Brexit into the word xenophobic, which means hating foreigners. And I'm talking to you, of course, at a very great moment of crisis and dismay and shock for my traumatized country, which I didn't expect even this time last year when I was having wonderful presentation about fairy tales. We've gone a long way from fairy tales to Tanya. Thank you. So I'm taking as serious the title I was given of the overall theme, which was Theories and Practices of Art and Design, Social, Socio-Cultural, Economic and Political Contexts. And this idea of the theorizing of what is happening in crowds is particularly interesting to me. Also, in terms of the fact that there has to be a Russian element in my talk, and there's a Russian element in everything, possibly including Brexit, I thought I took this particular photo during the demonstration on my camera, where you can see Russian subversion. Not yet, of course, 100% proven, but we're in this period of destabilizing democracies where the media of destabilization is what's so important. So the history of crowds, of course, goes right back to the very first representations of the proletariat. This is a pre-futurist representation of the so-called Fourth Estate, the workers. Very, very famous work by Giuseppe Polizza da Volpedo. So what is interesting is this idea of the coming into representation of a whole class of people hitherto excluded from the fine arts. But in terms nowadays, and then this was my little spiel, which needed more than a subtitle. It says, the long history of theorizing crowds coincides with the history of working class revolution and protest. The increasing sophistication of means of propaganda and the use of new media, from newspapers, radio, photography, film and TV, to the fine arts and the medium of exhibition installation. My very short presentation is highly selective. It shows theories whose impact must be read cumulatively and relates to certain artworks. These have marked my own career as a Western art historian. Inasmuch as I can't be comprehensive, I'm actually talking about things that have made me think, which is useful perhaps for you. My own career focus, which began, as you know, focusing on Paris and extending to Europe and wider histories involving diasporas, including Russian artists. The Russia-USSR story is not presented here, including photo montage, but also social realism, and of course Russian new media and so forth. I begin and end in the present. I'm going to show you the work of two contemporary artists, and I'm pleased to introduce particularly the theoretician Sergei Cha, who I'll talk about. So if you look at this very well-known futurist work by Umberto Boccioni as early as 1910, a huge contrast with the previous image. You can see from today's point of view almost algorithms in motion. When one normally studies futurism, we talk about lines of force. But this way in which horses as men and the emotions of riot are represented, I think looks in many ways, apart from the horses perhaps extremely topical. And already with Carlo Carra's work here, which is called The Funeral of the Anarchist Gallo, what is interesting, and what Walter Benjamin is later going to talk about, is in crowds the mixture of emotions. There are people who are in mourning for the death of their leader. But of course, the police repression provokes anger and violence. So the problem is that the mixture of emotions are always very important in representing the crowd. And then, of course, in thinking about how to theorize this. And even in Cubism, I remember my first time I saw this painting, which is in the Pompidou Center. It's called La Noce, the wedding. I really didn't understand these nasty little men with fists you can see behind the surface of this, which is supposed to be almost like the white of a woman's body. What are those nasty little men up to there? I'm afraid to say I believe they are men. And this is because at this time, you're in a situation where there is going to be this theorization of the crowd. I'll get back to it, to the futurist moment in a second. Now, first of all, the representation of the crowd goes back a very long way. And this is a very, very famous frontispiece for Thomas Hobbes's work, Leviathan. He was an author writing in the English Civil War, which is, as you know, when they first cut the head of a king off. And this is a representation, if you like, of benign monarchy, the idea of the body politic, where the benign ruler, or in this case monarch, is actually embracing everybody into this idea of a reign. All the people are looking up to him. And of course, this, as an idea, does not have a very, very long shelf life, the divine monarchy side of it. But what Hobbes was actually doing was trying to discuss the structure of legitimate government. If we zoom to the early 19th century, looking back at things, that idea simply of the masses and good government collapses when you get very, very strange things happening. So this crazy Scottish, well, not crazy, but this rather eccentric Scottish theoretician called Charles Mackay wrote this book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Because even if you think of Dutch Protestant capitalism, the fact that everyone went absolutely crazy about tulips, and tulips were the most precious commodity, the tulip craze, is something that he discusses. He also discusses alchemy. He discusses the craze for people going on the crusades and all sorts of other things. So the idea that the crowds, and even at the highest level of businessmen, can be deluded is a very interesting interim moment before the great theoretician, who's so much better known, who introduces already, a burgeoning 19th century discipline, the idea that there must be such a thing as group psychology. Güstave Le Bon, The Psychology of Crowds. Of course, I'm just giving you titles. You can look back and Google all these things. You'll have my presentation stuck in your computer. But the idea that there's psychology, and the idea that immediately the police force and the military are going to think, this is for the military, this is a very different idea from the simple Napoleonic idea of the esprit du corps, making all the soldiers obey the captain, which is the spirit of the body of soldiers. So the psychology of crowd, and every single book, I've tried to find the first edition, image-wise, but all these great books go into multiple editions and come out again and again and are read again and again. In fact, even that isn't the first edition. I think that's like the 29th edition of Güstave Le Bon's Psychology of Crowds. So one goes from that to two publications that come out, that come out simultaneously with those futurist works I was showing you. One is the concept, promoted by the poet Jüля Ромена, called unanisme, which is the same as the English word unanimous, everybody with one soul. And he writes in these poems about he introduces in a very modern way into his poetry, just as Giacomo Ballo was introducing electric light. He introduces electricity and even motor cars and the explosions inside the guts of motor cars into this poem, which is talking about particles and seeing people and their desires as well as particles of a greater crowd. So he is doing that from a poetic point of view, but at the same time, Jorjha Sореля is the first theoretician of violence, and here the actual author is a political revolutionary, a political anarcho-syndicalist, who is the first person to write about violence, and here's the person that Walter Benjamin reads when Walter Benjamin in 1921 writes The Psychology of Violence. But then, something which was interesting for me when I was writing my book about Picasso and Marx, when Benjamin is a Jewish exile who's had to flee Germany and is part of a community of 40,000 Jewish exiles in Paris, he witnesses the Popular Front, not only the very happy processions of people who here, these are artists and writers inscribing themselves into a great tradition going back to Voltaire and Courbet, Signac, who was going to Russia at this time, happy, peaceful, proud procession. But by 1937, when there have been strikes that have involved police brutality, and this is another mourning, this is the same as the anarchist Gallo funeral, this is another funeral demonstration where there is group mourning, group outrage, and potential violence. He asked this very interesting question. There's a wonderful article called Walter Benjamin, Reader of Jorjha Sореля, and Benjamin asks, when and under what conditions a legal action must convert itself into an illegal action, and an illegal action into a violent act. So that's very interesting. And by the time he's writing, the very largely immigré school of Paris is in a very perilous situation. And I can't give you a whole lecture on the School of Paris, let alone in 10 minutes. But for example, Jacques Lifshitz, who'd come from Lithuania, whose work was very specifically anti-fascist, David and Goliath, Prometheus, disguised as the Nazi eagle and so forth, he has actually made it to being super rich with a wonderful villa designed by Le Corbusier. The rich, successful Jewish émigré artists of the School of Paris. And remember, the School of Paris is a euphemism for immigré and largely Jewish artists, people like Chagall, Modigliani. He would be able to go to New York, whereas the poor ones were basically deported and exterminated. So one's talking about very, very serious things. Remember, the poet Heinrich Heine said, first come books, then come people. And at this time, there is a huge Russophilia and, well, Sovietophilia and Sovietophobia, which is a big debate in Paris at the time because there's anti-Nazism and pro-communism happening. And what did this say? Oh, this is about that émigré stuff. Yes, I've just said that to you. There were huge, immigrant communities in the car plants in Billancourt, the cinema, and so forth, as well as fine arts. But, for example, Nikolai Berdiaev was the person who, as an émigré white Russian theologian, was trying to say, look, let's look at communism as a system and see how it's actually a tracing of the psychological structures and the eschatological structures of Christianity, with poor people getting their rewards in heaven, as no jam tomorrow, as it says in Alice in Wonderland. And so he was writing in Catholic circles, your great friend, I have the greatest admiration and respect for Илья Эренбурg, for what he did at the end of his life. He was doing the most extraordinary propaganda number, doing his My Paris, just taking photos of tramps and alcoholics and people being very, very miserable at this time, as a kind of, to show the Soviet Union what a wonderful contrast Moscow was. But much more to the point is the huge Comintern operation that's going on all over Europe, which I'm very, very interested in. So Wille Münzenberg is the person who moves from being Stalin's man in Berlin after the Reichstag fire and the persecution of German communists to Paris to mastermind the whole of the Comintern operation in Paris. But things get worse and worse. And finally, by 1937, he's allying himself with the German socialists in Paris. And finally, as a culmination of the expose of all his previous techniques, he publishes this book, and you can see Édition du Carrefour. This is published in Paris by a French publishing house, Propaganda as a Weapon. And of course, he is assassinated by 1940 in horrible circumstances. Well, everything by 1940 is very dreadful, with internment camps for all foreigners and so forth. But he was obviously assassinated by Stalin's henchmen, as it were. But he is quoted, because this is an absolutely groundbreaking book, he is quoted in the book that I want to promote in my lecture, which is Chakutin's Rape of the Crowd by Political Propaganda. Now, this is a very different kind of title from Propaganda as a Weapon. This is saying, what does this do to people? Now, I don't know what the word is. You're going to be able to tell me at the end of my lecture for the word rape in Russian. But viol is not violation. The root of viol, like you can violate a treaty, and that's not as aggressive or indeed as sexualized as the word viol. He really talks about the way that people are mind-raped by propaganda. And of course, this book was instantly pulped when the Nazis invaded. The whole of the communist press, but this wasn't the communist press, was instantly non-available after 1939 and its publication. But it's going to come back. So one of the things he promoted was, for example, having counter symbols. He invented this idea of 3 arrows to whop things, but that is not very clever. It wasn't sophisticated enough, just to show you that, of course, in terms of what happened to Paris and in terms of the power of symbols, poor old Serge Chakutin didn't actually triumph. After the war, these things happen, which I have to zoom over, but there are certain key moments where discourse is affecting the artistic production. Of course, the Holocaust and how to respond adequately to it is the hugest question. This is personal experience by David Rousset, who would later become the great expose of the Soviet Gulag in publications from the 1950s onwards. And of course, it relates very immediately to the work of someone like Giacometti, whose work Sartre said reminded him of the martyrs of Buchenwald. One thing that I found very interesting in my research, this isn't part of the great chain of publications, but this book about how, this was in 1949, after a lot of Gestapo torture in Paris, and before the French said, what a good idea, let's torture everybody in Algeria, which I'm coming to in a second. This is, what was interesting for me is how torture was conceived of as something entirely medieval that had completely died out and wouldn't start up again, until it was very carefully and cleverly and powerfully used by totalitarian governments of either disposition in the 1930s. And we get to 1951, and Serge has been busily adding to this book. So this second edition is very, very, very much, it's got 300 extra pages added to it, which of course I can't synopsize, but it comes out just before the debates in Paris, where the country is completely divided in an almost civil war type of debate to do with Algeria, whether it's a French province, whether it deserves liberty. And the torn poster artists are specifically address themselves to the notion of propaganda and psychic propaganda, and indeed torture, not just mind rape, but the torture of bodies. Because on the one hand, this electoral poster torn by Wille says this man is dangerous, okay, and defacing photos is what, defacing posters is what was done as an anti-Nazi act during the occupation. But here, this was an advert for a swimming pool. But you can see this man is actually looking as though he's having that torture where you're, waterboarded. And this is just called the 14th of July, this work. So there's a happy 14th of July thing, a protest for peace in Algeria, and that at the same time. Just to show you how thinking about propaganda and what it does to bodies and minds is something that can enter explicitly into an exhibition. And as you can see, the exhibition was a pun, France Torn Apart. The idea of the torn poster and tearing the nation apart, coming together in 1961. And of course, it's something that goes on. I must emphasize that this is a right-wing poster. I'm very pro-Macron, of course, but the right-wing is saying that he is, and the left, because it's a very complicated situation, is saying that the Marianne Le Pen project underneath Macron. But you can see the Communist Party there, making itself the shield of the Marianne figure, the figure of France. So always, of course, you can do double speak, as George Orwell said, in these things. So the next most famous book about crowds and the kind of metamorphosis of the argument happens with Elias Canetti. And what I think is very interesting is that from Güstava Lebona, who himself was shocked to see the masses become so violent, to burn down the Tuileries, to burn down all the monuments in the middle of Paris, just before he started writing his thing. Canetti, like Freud, saw the Anschluss of Austria, saw all the soldiers coming in, and saw all the cheering crowds. And this is what really impelled him in exile as a Jewish Austrian, in exile in London, to write his very famous book, Crowds and Power. First of all, he wrote this this is an amazing image on the front of it, this very powerful novel, as early as 1935, and then this thing went into many, many editions. And what was strange for me, before I read this, I thought it was going to be far less anthropological. He's almost disguising his personal agenda and his passion with anthropology. But the interesting thing is, of course, he is by default post-Freudian. The previous people, including Chacotin, whom I've mentioned to you, are not, as it were, post-Freudian. As an Austrian, even as a he's not an anthropologist, as a writer using anthropology, he's of necessity post-Freudian. A non-theoretician, but a moment we must pause on. And strangely enough, this film by Stanley Kubrick, The Clockwork Orange, is just being restored, and there are posters for it all over London at the moment. This was a book that came out in '63, and what was funny, it was not funny, it's the height of the Cold War. Kubrick almost imagines that Russia has taken over England, and for example, when he says the word for friend is drug, so he uses this kind of Russian speak in The Clockwork Orange. And of course, this has got all sorts of shocking brainwashing stuff in it. As you know, this horrible moment is accompanied by Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But that is an important little kind of punctum in an argument where brainwashing enters big time. And I'm not going into all sorts of things, but one of the next things is really, really important, and it's probably something that many of you have not come across. You know that there are you might think very boring arguments about feminism and post-feminism and Russian women having responsible jobs in the Soviet time. This isn't the problem. The problem today, and to do with leaders and crowds and power, goes back to the construction of masculinity. This was not given any thought, in particular in feminist things, until this man, Klaus Theolite, in East Germany, came across some diaries of young boys who'd been turned into fascists. And in 1978, he published this 2-volume, very serious study called Male Fantasies, in which the most extraordinary misogyny and desire for blood were part of a construction of the strong, impermeable, internally armored masculine fighter. And this really revolutionized English literature studies and all sorts of other studies, historical studies. It's a very important book, which can also be applied to fashion theory and male fashions and so forth, if you want to. But this is a really important book because before that, even the very phrase, maybe I can teach you a really good phrase, the construction of masculinity, not just womanliness as a masquerade. We know this very famous text about how women perform their womanhood, going back to 1920s, but how masculinity is a performance and a duress and a stress and something acquired as well, very important. And so I just wanted to end very briefly, and I'm probably shooting over time, with two contemporary artists. You can read the things. Martin Dudek. These works were exhibited by Polish artists in London in 2017, before part of the Brexit arguments turned into anti-Polish arguments because of the immense amount of Eastern European immigration we have enjoyed and been enriched by since 2011. And what is interesting about this guy, very briefly, because I'm speeding up, is that he is a former Polish football hooligan who uses hooliganism and masculinity and what it means as part of his art. So here we have these are the trousers of his brother turned into sculpture, and a kind of turnstile you have to go to get into the exhibition. And the orange is like a very emotional color, but also the color of fans' anoraks. And there's another installation. I don't know what I'm saying down there, but you can read it in Russian. These are photos, like a kind of very pixelated on-off video, in fact, of a photojournal he took through a whole year of these assemblies, police, repression, riots, football, whatever. But it was very, very spectacular, actually, even on a small screen. And then these were his own kind of photo journal he made as a very young man. He was from quite a poor place, brought up in a housing block, you know, with very few recreational facilities. So football becomes this big thing of male bonding and so forth. And here again, his experience of a particular match in, I've got it down here, oh golly, what match was it? Poland versus Romania. And I've also mentioned another American theorist he found particularly inspiring, Raymond Monbois, Riots, Revolts, and Insurrections. Obviously, this was even more interesting. This is where he actually does a kind of hooligan act as a performance in a gallery. On the one hand, this is retrospectively amusing in a certain way. On another hand, it isn't, because in terms of the things like the adrenaline he experienced when he was involved in this in the past, and the adrenaline in the present, and the move into the gallery, it offers all sorts of questions. Incidentally, the London Gallery was one of my former students, and the artist I'm next going to show is also, and this is interesting from a Russian point of view, this is his balaclava football helmet. The idea of turning the crowd into anonymous people, where you lose your individuality and become one of the masses, is interesting. But this is funny because this is a former Soviet army helmet that all the police in Poland used to wear to bash people up with, apparently. And he's actually done a model of the football stadium inside this army helmet. So that was a particularly interesting sculptural piece in the show. But this, at the same time, in this other gallery called Copperfield, run by a former student of ours, William Dunn, was a marvelous female artist. And I think the fact that women artists can be involved in this question, just as I am speaking about it, is very important. So I want to promote Eva Axelrad and her very complex but beautiful exhibition called Sztama, which is a funny word in Polish, which means kind of boys getting together. And of course, I can't show her video, which you can see there, which looks on the one hand like a crown of thorns, and it's actually men's arms when they all dance around together. There's this torso, there's this idea of batons, made with things. And for her, reading William Golding's Lord of the Flies when she was a little girl was very important, and perhaps that was also a kind of classic translated into Russian. The Catholic dimension, which is part of Polish racism, is very, and Polish anti-Semitism is important, and this way that this uniform is almost like flesh, and the way that in the video there's this putting the finger into the flesh, almost like putting the finger into Christ's wound, is very interesting in her work. And there were finally these kind of miniature sculptures with these horrible pseudo-swastika elements on them that I'm just showing you very briefly. There's a funny problem here where 37 and 38 slogans got lost, and this was to show Polish fascists. And the next one was, which I find all very frightening. I mean, this is before Brexit. When I saw things like this, I couldn't believe it when my Polish friends sent this to me. Now we have the same thing. But this one, which says English fascists, I believe says Polish. I think there's a mistake down here. Anyway, in England, we're having exactly the same problem. These are early, pre-Brexit, you know, swastikas galore, not in the middle of London, but in disaffected and underfunded places, all men mostly. But you can see when it gets to Brexit, we have our female figures very, very involved. And it is very worrying how the insignia, the flag, the violence and the thing all gets together, and how there is this parallel. This is England, this is London, with people actually fighting each other. This is happening at this very moment. And here you have Paris. I mean, it's a shocking image. So the fact is, it's the history of the representation of this and the relationship between fine art and propaganda and what is actually happening is extremely strange. We'll have to see what comes out of this and wonder what subjects will be next year. So what did I want to say at the end? Yes, I thought that whereas I began with me, you'd far prefer me to end with Benedict Cumberbatch rather than me. But this was a very interesting, this is very important, this was a very interesting TV thing where he actually played the nerd who actually ran the Brexit campaign. We won't go into the psychology of this person called Dominic Cummings, but it was very evenly balanced, very important. I'm ending with him, as it were, for people who are fond of Benedict Cumberbatch and see how he is contributing in his own way to a very complex psychological reading of the debate. And this is my latest heroine. She only appeared about 3 days ago. This is the woman who's just got the Guardian Award for Journalism. And she is the woman who spent over a year tracing and finally exposing the firm that was disguised with this title, Cambridge, sounds very nice, Cambridge Analytica, that were related to all sorts of data manipulation. 40% of the Brexit campaign money was spent on data manipulation. And you see, the point is that Vote Leave, as is proven, committed crimes for which they have not been persecuted, electoral fraud. There are all these other things you can read as well. But this is the woman, so, you know, a single individual woman can make the most huge difference. This really exposed the whole thing. And that's what I think is so, heartening from that point of view, but very important. And this is the final slide, because I think it's very, very significant that only in 2016, for the very first time, has Chakutin been translated into Russian. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the kind of things that have been happening in Russia over the last even 5 years, but you can see, I wonder who the publisher was and what the decision was to publish it, that this is a very, very pertinent publication, 2016. Just to add a bit of color, that's Brazil, 1967. But my main desire was to link contemporary art and contemporary questions in politics to the fact of these theoreticians, this debate, and the fact that Chakutin, whom may be unfamiliar to you, is a very, very important participant who is, if you like, my present to the Congress. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for very interesting presentation. Now, any questions? Yes, please.
I think it's rather a remark. Maybe there are questions.
I have one question.
Yes.
Recently, we were discussing the issue. Really, the presentation was very interesting, and there are a lot of things which are interesting. But last week, we had a big discussion between ourselves during discussing absolutely different thing. We were discussing the book on propaganda. And as today, you mentioned many times the word propaganda, and in a way, it is a lot in the context of your presentation. We were at a loss what to do because we couldn't find. What we found in the Google, the explanation and definition of propaganda was the explanation of the facts, which is absolutely...
But that's like saying Pravda is a great newspaper, isn't it?
What do you... how can you explain what propaganda is, and what is the difference between explaining and propaganda?
Well, I think it's very interesting because your question goes back to this word scientific that people are very keen on using in conferences. Scientific as a means of research, which is not the way that it's used in England, means empirical probity in looking at results and input and results and so forth. And the problem is that you can even take Hobbes' Leviathan as propaganda. The idea is that there is a notional neutrality somewhere, which it is the whole problem of the hostility to deconstruction. Actually, deconstruction is highly empirical in terms of looking for a truth, which is not there in the surface. But obviously, I'm not talking about a thing saying vote Brexit versus the actual reasons. I think that once you get to media of communication, which have an effect on people's emotions and their desires and their level of education, let alone other questions like their gender, there's the whole business of reception. I think one could say propaganda is a use of communication, skillfully using media that wants to sway people's minds in a certain direction. It could be any direction, which is different from an empirical expose of the facts. But even empirical, in Brexit, the problem is there has been no detailed empirical expose of the facts, and many of them are based on economic predictions. But even the actual facts about what will happen in airports were never made clear when people first took this so-called democratic vote.
Thank you very much. And the last question, also connected with propaganda. When propaganda appeared?
When did it appear?
Yeah.
Probably with the early Christians in ancient Rome. I mean, it's a very long story.
So, thank you very much.
I think once you have your tools...
Thank you. It's one of the our suggestions. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. We of course feel for you the situation with Brexit. We feel for ourselves being also subjected to propaganda. But if I kind of try and distance the actual moment, the actual politics, and the research, and your research about Sergei Chakotyn, or Chakotyn, however you pronounce him, you reminded us that he was a Ivan Pavlov student. And of course, Pavlov's theory of conditional reflexes, as well as Bekhteyev's theory of reflexology, was used in the scientific approach to propaganda, which was forming in the early 20s in the Soviet Union. And what is interesting that reflexology and the theory of conditional reflexes was equally used in theater by theater directors like Meyerhold and Ivan Stanislavski. And it actually brings us back, brings the topic of performativity and performance into your study, because this is my favorite toy, performance.
Including this idea of performing gender, which precedes performing
gender, but also performing rage, or performing discipline.
Yes.
And is there a way where you can bring this dimension into the study of crowd crowd manifestations, whatever.
If you were coming to me, obviously we don't know each other, I would say, were you to come to me in a tutorial? Sometimes I say things off the top of my head, but sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. But what I would do would think of the exhibition I participated in a long time ago called Art and Science, L'Amour Corps, Art and Science, 1792 to 1992, in which Jean-Claire, the curator, was very eager to show how the theory of the humours, where they were represented by animals, you know, the lion, the wolf, and so forth, preceded the Cartesian, which takes us back to the fact that we're animals, for starters. And I think that I mean, what's interesting is when things become useful and when things become rediscovered. But the fact that people behaved like animals or people were animals, you don't need Darwin for that. That goes back a very long way. And so I was also very interested when I tried to research the actual real origins of reflection theory, that there were two Pavlovs, actually, one in Bulgaria, and they were both interested in this idea. I'm going to get lost and forget my details, but I think the fact that of animality and conditioned reflexes and things is very important. And the fact that all these disciplines come in, you know, psychology, Freud, and so forth, consecutively is interesting. Now we're in a... But of course, to look at it from what the Russians and the French would call a scientific point of view, to look at this cumulative body of theory doesn't help if you are an uneducated, very, very poor Brexit voter in the north of England whose emotions for voting have got nothing to do with the actual legal facts. So it's a really dreadful question. But I mean, it is to do with the fact that democracy for this expanded population is not working anymore. But I'm a bit worried about time and other participants. Perhaps we should go on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Vlad, you wanted to ask something, the last question.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. A very quick question about a disappearance of a word, and the word is the masses. It got studied in the 1990s. The word has kind of began to disappear from the British discourse, you know, in newspapers, etc. We stopped saying the word the masses. And in your lecture, you kept using the word the crowd, right? Which obviously reminds me of that wonderful exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, The Face in the Crowd. So I wonder if the crowd is a new kind of polite neoliberal way of talking about the masses, or is that really a way to suggest a new kind of thinking, where it's even more chaotic, not economically kind of grounded?
I just think in England, masses is very politically connotated and was very kind of post-communist and lefty. And people are now more interested in looking at like helicopter photos of thousands of people. 1 million people were supposed to have demonstrated, which really goes beyond the word crowd. I think I was psychologically using the word crowd because of crowds and power. But even when people are just doing algorithms to look at people moving in the London Underground, they're not talking about crowds. I think crowds is also a word that has been dépassé by events. I think events have taken over. I think the word crowd is too small. So I mean, I don't see we can go back to the word masses, but I think we're more into talking about statistics. You know, 1 million people turned up to protest. But it's a good question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, very much for a very interesting presentation. And now let me introduce Yulia Papushina. And Yulia will speak Russian, yeah? And we will have this translated.
Добрый день. Спасибо большое организаторам за приглашение, за возможность представить результаты своего исследования такой замечательной аудитории. Мое исследование будет посвящено анализу позднесоветского производства моды в крупном советском закрытом городе Пермь.
Hello everyone. First of all, the words of gratitude to the organizers for the invitation. And my talk today will be devoted to the fashion production in the late USSR in the closed city of Perm.
Пермь — это крупный промышленный центр, расположенный на востоке европейской части России. До конца 80-х годов город был закрытым, то есть иностранцы не могли получить разрешение и приехать в город из-за большого количества там стратегически важных военных объектов.
Perm is an industrial city located in the east of the European part of Russia, and until the end of the 80s, it was a closed entry city. That means that the foreigners were not allowed to enter the city because of the strategic military facilities.
Сейчас я кратко расскажу, во-первых, почему, собственно, мне кажется, что эта тема интересна кому-то за пределами Перми и, может быть, даже кому-то из зарубежных коллег. Потом я расскажу, что является теоретической основой, откуда, собственно, взялись данные, что я узнала и почему это интересно.
So in this presentation, I'm planning to talk about the following things. First, why this topic matters, not only for the locals, but also for the foreign community, for the international community. Then the theoretical background, the methodology I use, and the data and how I analyze it.
Итак, прежде всего, Советский Союз — это не единственное общество, в котором мода развивалась в более или менее аномальных условиях. И сегодня, в общем, мы видим достаточно много ограничений для развития моды, которые могут повлиять на то, как производится мода, как она потребляется. Кроме того, насколько я знаю, мое исследование — это первая попытка применить теорию Бурдье и теорию и феноменологию моды, разработанную Фредериком Асперсом, для анализа советской ситуации, советских процессов производства. То есть это попытка применить уже довольно известный, одна теория вообще является классической теорией поля производства моды в новых условиях в российском контексте и узнать что-то новое, в советском контексте, простите, и узнать что-то новое именно об этом советском контексте, используя, в общем, западные теории. Кроме того, существующие исследования последовательно игнорируют региональный контекст советской моды, и понятно почему.
So why this topic matters? First of all, the Soviet society was not the only one where the fashion was developing in the, so to speak, abnormal conditions. I mean here it's both production and consumption. The second thing that here I'm applying Bourdieu's and Aspers's theories, and this is the way of analyzing the Soviet context, the Soviet society, and the fashion production in it through the foreign international theories. And then I think that many pieces of research actually ignore the regional context of the Soviet fashion production.
Хотя Советский Союз обладал одной из самых развитых региональных систем моделирования, только в РСФСР домов моделей было 18, и там работало несколько тысяч человек.
Actually, in the Soviet time, there was a very developed network of the fashion design all over Russia. There was so-called the houses of models where the fashion was produced and designed. There were 18 of them in Russia, and thousands of people worked there.
Таким образом, я пытаюсь в своем исследовании ответить на два основных вопроса, точнее, на три основных вопроса. Первый вопрос связан с тем, как выглядело поле производства советской моды во времена позднего социализма, как выглядело поле ограниченного производства, как выглядело поле массового производства, как накапливался капитал и как он использовался.
So in this research, I'm trying to answer two or rather three questions. First of all, what was the field of production like, fashion production in the late Soviet society? What was the mass production and the limited production like?
Во-вторых, поскольку основная идея Бурдье заключается в том, что поле производства развивается через конкуренцию, я хотела бы понять, как выглядела конкуренция, где она локализовалась, кто принимал решения о каких-то действиях, связанных с конкуренцией.
And the second thing, since Bourdieu put special emphasis on competition, I am analyzing the competition, how it was localized and who made the corresponding decisions.
Кроме того, меня интересует человеческое измерение производства моды, поэтому я использую теорию феноменологии моды теория феноменологии моды Патрика Асперса, которая пытается понять и которая позволяет понять, какой смысл вкладывали, собственно, модельеры в то, что они делали, и как конструировалась их профессиональная идентичность.
Another thing that interests me is the human dimension of fashion production. That is why here I base my studies on the fashion phenomenology by Patrick Aspers, and I'm trying to understand what meanings, what senses the designers were trying to put in their creation.
Очень быстро пробежимся по источникам. Я использовала архивные материалы из различных архивов. Я брала интервью у бывших модельеров, которые работали в Пермском доме моделей, а также рассматривала разные материалы, которые были созданы в 70-е, 80-е годы в доме моделей или на материале дома моделей.
Here are the resources that I used. First, I consulted a few archives in the Perm region and in the Russian State Archive of Economics. Then I carried out 7 interviews with the designers that were employed at the House of Models, the regional one in Perm, and I analyzed the films, photos from the 70s and the 80s.
Я хотела бы начать с накопления индивидуального капитала, поскольку Бурдье большое внимание уделял, поскольку Бурдье одной из своих идей формулировал то, что именно благодаря капиталу актор занимает ту или иную позицию в поле производства, доминирующую позицию или позицию претендента.
First, I would like to focus on the individual capital. According to Bourdieu, it was his idea that the capital helps the actor to occupy a certain position in the production field, be that a dominant position or not.
Образование играло ключевую роль в формировании специфического капитала молодого советского модельера. Человек мог заканчивать вуз или не заканчивать вуз. И если человек заканчивал престижный советский вуз, будь то текстильный институт или училище имени Мухина, это открывало для него многие двери и делало его или ее карьеру при наличии амбиций достаточно быстрой.
One of the crucial elements of this capital was education for the young Soviet designers. They could graduate from the bigger universities and institutes like the Textile Institute and the Mukhina School, and that could open all the doors for them if they had these certain ambitions.
Кроме сугубо профессиональных качеств, в престижных советских вузах формировалась еще такая вещь, как насмотренность, причем насмотренность как связанная с общекультурными вопросами, например, новые выставки, новые спектакли, так и насмотренность, связанная с западной модой, потому что люди, учившиеся в Москве или Ленинграде, могли увидеть какие-то международные конгрессы моды, фестивали моды.
Another important professional element that the education could provide the young designers with is the acquaintance with the world of fashion and the world of culture in general. So if the students studied in Leningrad, that's the former name of St. Petersburg, or in Moscow, they could attend fashion shows or different exhibitions.
Однако выпускники престижных советских вузов были редкой птицей в провинции. До 1968 года в Пермском доме моделей не было дипломированных модельеров. Дом моделей был основан в 1961 году. Откуда брались модельеры? Люди приходили либо из ателье, либо просто после школы со специальности, после получения профессии швея. В таких случаях люди накапливали свой капитал на месте.
But actually, the graduates of large institutes in Moscow and St. Petersburg very rarely went to the regions to work. For example, in Perm, the House of Design of Models was founded in 1961, but until 1968, there was not a single employee there which would have a diploma from one of the central universities. So most of the people came from either the sewing ateliers, or they just graduated from the sewer school, and then they had to amass their capital while working.
У последнего варианта были свои плюсы и минусы, потому что модельеры, работавшие в доме моделей с самого начала, хорошо понимали запросы фабрик. А советские дома моделей работали именно для фабрик. 80% моделей, которые они создавали, отправлялось на швейное производство. А с другой стороны, конечно, таким модельерам было довольно сложно делать творческие коллекции, которые были очень важны для коммуникации с представителями Министерства легкой промышленности и московских моделирующих центров.
The latter option of amassing the capital at the working place had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages being that they knew really well the context of productions and the requests, the demands of the factories, because 80% of their design went straight into the mass production. But on the other hand, they had little skills with creating, so to speak, creative collections that had to be produced for the central institutions and had to be negotiated, for example, with the Ministry of the Light Industries.
And there are some very few pictures. You can see here sketches by Leonid Lemikhov, who was the creative leader of Perm clothing fashion houses in the end of 90s and the beginning of 80s. And one more. And, ну и, наверное, все-таки я вернусь к русскому языку, извините. Ключевая вещь, которую мне удалось обнаружить, что при внешне очень при разительных внешних различиях в советском поле производства моды я обнаружила ту же структуру, что и в выводах Бурдье и Асперса. Точно так же есть два поля производства, ограниченное и массовое, которые отличаются по ряду параметров.
The key thing that came to in my research is that despite the evident external differences, actually there were a lot of similarities in between the Soviet fashion production and the fashion production described by Bourdieu and Aspers. So I came to the conclusion that, quite like in their research, in the Soviet fashion production, there were two production fields, one limited and the other the mass production.
Ключевым различием было то, что ограниченное производство было ориентировано на узкий круг знатоков, которые концентрировались в центральных домах моделей, а поле массового производства было ориентировано на экспертов с фабрик, которые принимали решения о принятии или непринятии моделей в производство. В поле ограниченного производства больше всего ценилась оригинальность, тогда как в поле массового производства пригодность для механизированных потоков производства.
The key differences that I would love to highlight here is that the limited production was oriented at the connoisseurs that worked in the central fashion houses, and the mass production was rather oriented at the experts from the factories that actually made the decision of whether or not to accept the design. And the limited production was characterized by originality, that was the main factor, and the mass production was rather characterized by the factor of whether or not the design was suitable for the mechanized production, for the factory work.
Различие полей поддерживалось также тем, что люди, работающие в поле ограниченного производства, понимали свою деятельность как деятельность художников, тогда как люди, работающие на массовое производство, понимали себя как промышленников, то есть как людей, специально работающих именно на массовое производство.
Another difference is the identity of the designers. Those who worked for the limited production saw themselves as artists, while those who worked for the mass production thought of themselves as industrial workers.
Кроме того, художник и промышленник выполняли разные функции в доме моделей. Художник генерировал идеи, осуществлял лидерство, организовывал коллективный труд, мог вести переговоры, когда были какие-то спорные вопросы, тогда как промышленник решал задачу совмещения моды и массового производства и находил баланс интересов между фабриками и модой.
Actually, their jobs and their responsibilities were also different. The artists focused more on ideas, leadership, team building, and negotiations of complicated cases, while those who focused on the industrial production were trying to find that trade-off between fashion and mass industrial production.
Интересно, что в советской моде не было полного разделения между полем ограниченного производства и полем массового производства. Любой художник-модельер, даже если он художник, да, с идентичностью художника, должен был создать 5 или 6 моделей в месяц для массового производства, тогда как промышленники участвовали в подготовке творческих коллекций. То есть промышленники вытягивали в лотерею или каким-то другим образом получали свои задания, и потом с помощью художника развивали его центральную идею для коллекции.
It's interesting that there was no clear boundary between the limited and the mass production in the Soviet Union. Those who had the identity of the artist still had to create 5-6 models every month for mass production, and those who focused on mass production had to help the artists in their creative collections.
Тема конкуренции в моем исследовании оказалась тесно связана с полем ограниченного производства моды, потому что технически в поле массового производства конкуренция была невозможна.
The topic of competition in my research was related only to the limited fashion production because there was no competition in the mass production.
Региональные дома моделей конкурировали за внимание министерства и высокую оценку своей работы, потому что это могло помочь им, и, собственно, помогало им получить дополнительные ресурсы. Например, поддержку в постройке нового здания или зарубежную командировку с представлением своих моделей на престижной западной ярмарке, например, Лейпцигской международной ярмарке.
As for the regional fashion houses, they were striving to be recognized by Moscow because that was a resource that helped them either, for example, to build a new facility if they needed that, or to win a business trip, to get a business trip somewhere abroad to present their fashions, for example, to the Leipzig fair.
И в заключение, наверное, с учетом ограничений времени, которое у меня есть, я хотела бы закончить тем, что, как мне кажется, главный результат, который я получила, это то, что, несмотря на внешнее отличие советской моды от моды, советских процессов, советской системы производства моды от западной системы производства моды, структурно, тем не менее, сходство довольно существенное, так же, как и в идентичности художников-модельеров, работавших в этой области.
To conclude, since we don't have much time, unfortunately, I would like to say that the biggest result for me of my research is that despite all the external differences that existed between fashion production in the Soviet Union and in the West, there were a lot of structural similarities of the production process itself and of the construction of the identity of the artist-designer.
И второй, наиболее важный для меня результат заключается в том, что применение теории поля производства и феноменологии рынка моды позволило мне увидеть скрытые механизмы согласования интересов и социального баланса внутри рабочего коллектива, который, собственно, создавал моду в очень сложных для профессионалов условиях.
The second result is that by using the notions, the theory of the production field and phenomenology of the fashion market, I saw the hidden mechanisms of negotiating interests and the balance that existed in the teams that created fashion in really complicated conditions.
Спасибо большое за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. This isn't a question rather than a remark. The most perverse exhibition I've ever seen in my life involving Soviet and post-Soviet things, including fashion, I just wanted to tell you, is called Ekaterina Prospect. And it was in Antwerp. And it mixed up things like Russian imperial military uniforms with Soviet women's enormous knickers and vests and football T-shirts, handmade football T-shirts, and postmodern, well, proto-postmodern stuff of the period you're discussing, like punk. Now, I don't think that, for example, women in young punks in St. Petersburg, in terms of how they dressed up to go out, would be in either of your categories. They wouldn't be in posh designer category, and they wouldn't be in ordinary working people's category. So there is that little leeway for self-invention. But I just wanted to tell you, this is the most weird. It was curated by the two fashion designers called Rolf and Victor and Rolf. Have you heard of those? They're very famous. I thought you were all fashion students. Victor and Rolf is this. Yeah. Oh, you aren't all. Well, some of you may be fashion students. You must be a fashion student. Victor and Rolf. It's curated by them, and it's just so weird. You must look at it because it really is like a counter proposition that fascinatingly, relates to your wonderful talk. Thank you.
So now I want to give the floor to Claire Baker.
Dobre utro. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I find it very difficult to stand in one place and not talk for a very long time. So I'm going to do my very best to stick to my notes. I also need to see the screen myself and not that one. That's just a thing. Anyway, so my name is Claire Baker. I'm a lecturer in textiles at the Northern School of Art in the northeast of England. I'm also a creative practitioner producing embroidery, textiles, mixed media work, and for the last 4 years I've been concerned with research in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. My paper that I want to talk about, this body of work, is, the title's there, An Experiential Investigation into the Embroidery Practices of the Chernobyl Babushka. Obviously, there's a lot of issues surrounding the world's worst nuclear accident in 1986, but I have very few minutes, so I'm concentrating on the textiles aspect and how I used embroidery to gain some really in-depth personal narratives from the self-settlers. The self-settlers are a small number of people who were allowed to return to the zone in 1987, a year after the accident, and at the moment, there's only 128 people left, but they actually live within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This is Baba Hannah. She is absolutely gorgeous, but they have a long history of embroidery, and in my view, it's really important that we look at this because there's a lot of regional examples that are going to be lost, basically, within 10 years. Everything will be gone. The babushkas and dadushkas, I'm calling them babushkas as in general because 80% of the self-settlers are women, and there are only 128 left, so 20 died just last year, so time is running out, and it's my intention to kind of spread the story, gain some interest and save as much of their embroidered examples as possible. Right, so that's just the introduction. The beauty of the exclusion zone and working there, which I have done for 4 years, over 15 plus separate visits. I hate microphones, I'm really sorry. I've spent over 30 days altogether in the zone. And, right, there's a lot going on here. I don't know what's happened. I'll just go back to the beginning. Yeah, right, okay. So about 18 months ago, I started my project, Embroidery as a Language, and it was about using the process of embroidery as a bonding device. So because we had this shared interest that I'd found out in the previous 2 years, there's examples of embroideries in every self-settler home, and asking the babushkas initially just questions about it, I found they were really surprised that anyone was interested, that they had any value at all in terms of that people would want to know about them. So it was really a link and a way in to talk to the self-settlers and gain much more authentic stories and narrative about the whole of their lives. And really, they shouldn't be defined by the Chernobyl accident, which unfortunately, usually there are. So it really worked in terms of the context of action research methodology. I believe it needs to be an ongoing initiative, even though it's getting more and more difficult, but it's of particular importance and relevance due to the obsolescence of this community and its artifacts. The project did lead to the building of relationships and very close bonds between us. Right, so the project, although based on embroidery, covered notions of the list. So things like place, non-place, home, domesticity, culture, isolated society, and most of all, loss. In terms of the narratives of the self-settlers, though, the babushkas believe that it's all about the motherland. They have really fond memories of Russian times, working in the collective farms. Everything was much easier, even though they had to work from dawn until dusk just for produce for their wages. Yeah, so the value of the research is in the number of critical frameworks to which it can be applied. And I want to talk just for 30 seconds about the motherland. They believe, and the reason for them returning to their home is that it is their land, their home. Why should they leave? It's all about their heritage and continuing that heritage. It's where they were brought up. It's where the graves of their loved ones remain. Valentina from the village of Tremsey, she said, "My husband is buried there, how can I leave?" So the benefits they get from living there is more kind of mindfulness and well-being and mental kind of settlement, really. So that seems to negate any ill health effects from living in a contaminated area, which actually is a lot cleaner than some of the areas outside of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, because it's been cleaned up so well. But a lot of the self-settlers said that being in a city would have killed me. And actually, the babushkas, they have a 10-year longer life expectancy than their contemporaries who now still live in the cities, and that's their belief because they're so happy to be living on this land. One point is that some of the villages that they were originally evacuated to, because after the accident in 1986, all the people were evacuated, either forcefully or not forcefully. Some of the babushkas did hide in the forest, which is another reason why they're still there, semi-illegally. But basically, some of the villages that they were evacuated to were more contaminated than the village they left. So that's another reason why they came back. So the aims of the project was to examine the role of embroidery as a means of communication, to revive the babushkas' interest in embroidery and learn from their practice. Basically, some of them haven't done embroidery since they were young, even though they have many, many examples of embroideries from past times. So it was my intention to try and get them to do it again, but with me. So I went to visit them on a one-to-one basis around each of the homes, taking a piece of work with me. They were very nervous at first. They said, "Oh, I might not be able to do it anymore. I can't see very well." A lot of them have eyesight issues from radiation effects and also rheumatism and arthritis due to age, really. But they really, really tried and they really, really wanted to do it. And once they started stitching, it was such an incredible thing to see. It was really emotional. They were so happy. The faces lit up, literally. My other intention, is to build an archive. So I'm collecting photographically as well as physical samples of embroideries, which hopefully will be published eventually. So there's a list of my methodology. I'm going to miss that out because I don't want to run out of time. But basically, the newness of the work is that the communal pieces, so the piece of work that I worked with the babushkas on an individual basis, was carried around the homes. It's a very isolated and spread out community. Some of them don't see anybody. This is Maria. She lives in an abandoned village on her own. She's the only one in the village. There's 2 firemen that occasionally stay there when they're working in the zone, but generally she's completely alone. So the piece of work actually was bringing these people together, because when I took the piece of work to one babushka's house, they would say, well, who did that bit? Oh my God, remember her? And also what I did was, because I was always taking photographs of everything, and they were like, what are you taking a photograph of my sink for? And I'm like, well. So I made a little booklet of photographs that I'd taken on previous visits that I took around so they could understand kind of my intentions and what I wanted it for, where it was going. But they were more interested in, oh my God, look at Maria, what is she wearing? And, oh, there's Ivan, I haven't seen him for years, he was one for the girls. You know, it was like a talking point as well, so it was a really good thing. Yeah, so this can also be used as a model for any isolated people or groups. So this was actually when we were working on the piece of work. This is Baba Hannah again. She hadn't stitched for 69 years, and she was absolutely delighted. She didn't listen to my instructions, but it didn't matter. It was all about just the needle going in to the fabric and coming out. And the design we were working on was kind of large scale, so there was big holes and big eyes in the needle to make it easy for them. The reading glasses she's wearing, we have a shop in England called the Pound Shop, where everything is £1. So I took a stash of these reading glasses with me. It was the best thing. They absolutely loved these reading glasses. So yeah, and the square format was based on the traditional headscarves in order for them not to really be afraid of it, and traditional design. So the floral one in the top in the middle, that was a simplified design of one of the village women's own embroideries. So another thing I was really interested in was how they live and aspects of the everyday, and that was mostly what I was photographing along with the embroidery, and I thought it was very evocative. And these photographs, when I took them home and looked at them again, I found them incredibly poignant, and they told a whole narrative of their own, because these self-settlers have very little, but they do have a lot of textiles and colour in their lives. So what they do have is very important. The interesting thing about this was photography was used just to record and document at the beginning of the project, but eventually it became an outcome in its own right, and I have exhibited those photographs. This is Matriona and Vasily. Matriona made this embroidery for her granddaughter's wedding. She still has it, but because her granddaughter didn't want it at her wedding, she said it was too old-fashioned, and she was kind of heartbroken by that. So she's actually given it to me, this piece. She wants other people to see it. She's actually passed away a year after that was taken, so just last year. And I've visited Vasily since, and he was a heartbroken man, but this is quite a nice story. He found a new girlfriend in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It was a year after his wife had passed, but then when I went to see him in December last year, he had ТАТЬЯНа, and he was so happy. So happy, it was lovely. And it's like, how have you found a girlfriend in the Chernobyl exclusion zone? I can't get a boyfriend. Never mind. So some of the conclusions were that I did manage to introduce embroidery to some of the babushkas. I do intend to keep going and try and access more. This is Baba Hana. This was in December this year when I went back. They'd gathered a few babushkas together so that I could visit more people. And this is one of the booklets that I'd made. So you can kind of see Baba Hana's on the front of the book. So that was when they were discussing what the other women were wearing, and you know. So in the future, I'm going to carry the same cloth, because even though I've worked with quite a number of women, they've only done kind of that much each, because it takes a long time. And so I intend to keep taking that around with me as long as I can manage to get there. What else have I got? Yeah, as a group, these people do feel that they've been forgotten about, and they believe that the government is just waiting for them to die and take the land. And there's a lot of political unrest there at the moment, and it's getting more and more difficult for me to get access to these women, so I'm really worried about this. I have visited, the last time I visited was in January, and that was really difficult. And while I was there, just to give you an indication really of the political situation, I was with a photographer from Paris, and he had Google Maps on his phone. So the first day we were traveling around the villages and he was mapping them on his Google Maps. The next day, when we set off, Google Maps, no villages on the maps anymore. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but basically, I don't know how they've done it, but all the villages that exist in the Chernobyl zone are not there anymore on the maps. Also, they're refusing entry to the villages. The only thing left on the maps is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself and Pripyat. So that's really scary. Also, it's not called the Chernobyl exclusion zone anymore. So this was overnight. It changed to the radio ecological nature reserve. So it's quite scary. And also these issues that were raised from the accident are still really relevant today, and everybody seems to have forgotten about it. Some of my students who were like 18, half of them have never even heard of it. So I think it's really important to continue this project. So this is an example of some textiles within an abandoned cottage. So when everyone was evacuated, initially they were told they couldn't take textiles with them because they absorbed the radioactive particles more than anything else. So they've been just left there. So they're rotting away, and I think it's very sad because the textiles and the usually the icons that they surround, the very few things that are actually left. And this was me with Valentina in December, and I feel really, really bad because I promised Valentina that I would visit her again at the end of January. I knew I was going back, but because of the permit situation and the snow, I couldn't actually reach her. So I tried to go again this month, to plan to go this month. I can't, it's not allowed. So I'm like, oh my God, what's Valentina going to think? You know, I built up this relationship. Yes, I'll come back in January, we'll do some more stitching. And it's just really horrible. So I've absolutely just ignored all my notes. Oh. I know if I've got a few minutes
You are speaking so emotional, so I can't show you 5 minutes note, but
right. Well, I've
sorry.
lost my place now, so. Is it 5 minutes or have I finished? 1 minute, right. Oh, well, that was the end. So, yeah, it's the 1 minute for questions. I've missed such a lot out, but honestly, I could talk for like 2 hours, half a day, 2 weeks. So that's just a little bit of a taster. I do have a paper that's more about the photography and the anthropology of it, and I can give you the website later if anybody's interested in reading that. But also I've got some postcards that I've brought that I'll leave on the registration table. I'll just have a look at my last page to see if I've missed out anything really important.
So are you going
good question. I'll just forget about that. Yeah, the plan for the project was to use embroidery in the process of embroidery as the language. So I did need a translator after our kind of one-to-one session. So I would go in there, be introduced, fill in the ethics forms, get them to sign and make sure they understood what I was going to use the information for eventually. But then we were left alone and we communicated with facial expressions, with actions. It was very funny. But to get the in-depth, detailed information, obviously I did need a translator because my Russian is non-existent, really. And they were not good at English either. So Valentina, though, she could speak a little bit of German, which confused me quite a lot, even though I do speak a little bit of German. But she did expect me to understand. They all expect me to understand, so they talk and talk and talk, and I'm like, yeah, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying. And I'd go, ja nie понимаю, and they'd just carry on. So they're so lovely, and they're such strong people, and it's like, they're like heroes and heroines because they've gone for what they believe in and what they want in their life, and they've gone and they've done it no matter what. And I think they're incredible people.
Thank you very much, Claire. You were speaking so interesting, and I forgot about time. And when I looked at the watch, I saw that we passed all the
Oh, I'm
limits.
so sorry.
So thank you very much. And any questions?
Well, thank you so much. It's very moving. It's really heartbreaking, breaking. But I want to ask that I noticed from looking at your other talks at other conferences that you also sometimes combine a formal paper with an embroidery workshop. And I wanted to ask, why do you do that, and how does it look, and who participates?
Right, I think it's more about, I'm not a typical academic, and I feel that, well, the positive side of that is that everybody can understand me, and it's because of the interest in the subject, I think, really, that it's very engaging, and I feel that people, if you have smaller groups, they're more willing to ask you more questions. You can tell people more about the project, but also they tell you their experiences as well and what their grandma used to do. And it's the same kind of the world over that people have this textile heritage, and everybody knows somebody who did the traditional stitch. And everybody's got a story about that. So if you sit and you're actually doing some embroidery, it kind of just brings back memories.
Мой сегодняшний доклад будет посвящен современным Олимпийским играм, их церемониям и работе художников и дизайнеров. В олимпийской терминологии это называется «мастера искусств», чтобы обозначить всех людей творческих профессий, которые привлекают к оформлению Олимпийских игр, и особенностям их работы.
My today's talk will be about the contemporary Olympic Games and about all of the creative professionals that work at them. The term that they use officially is the Masters of Arts. That's basically all of the creative professionals, artists and designers.
Я хотела начать с этого слайда. Это фрагмент из фильма «Мстители. Война бесконечности». И там есть эпизод, когда два героя из вымышленного африканского государства Ваканда разговаривают между собой и обсуждают, что страна стала открыта миру. И один из них говорит: «Я вообще немножко на другое надеялась». Они готовятся к финальной битве этого фильма, что когда ты откроешь Ваканду миру, она говорит королю, будет немножко по-другому. Он спрашивает, на что ж ты надеялась? Например, что мы примем Олимпиаду, и к нам приедет Starbucks. Это комический эпизод, на самом деле, но в каждой шутке действительно есть доля шутки. И, конечно, если бы это государство существовало и попало в такие обстоятельства, в которых оно оказалось, использовать Олимпиаду как презентацию бренда страны для всего мира было бы очень логично.
I would like to use this opportunity to show you this episode from the Avengers, which you've probably watched, about the imaginary country of Wakanda, which is opening up to the world. And one of the characters here is saying to the king that I imagine it would be different. I imagine that the Olympic Games or the Starbucks would be introduced to our country. Of course, it's just a joke, but there is some truth in every joke, and especially in this one, because if such a stage really existed in these conditions, then the Olympic Games would probably be the best way to present the brand of the country to the whole world.
Да, я бы хотела обратить ваше внимание, что эта идея, что Олимпиада — это очень удобная площадка для презентации образа страны, правильного образа страны, используя, опять же, терминологию организаторов, сейчас очень важна. Почему, собственно, да, эта шутка попала в фильм? Когда что-то попадает в популярное кино, это значит, что этот стереотип уже очень глубоко существует в культуре. Я буду говорить сегодня об истории этой идеи, но надо понимать, что так было не всегда, эта идея существовала не всегда.
This idea of the Olympics being the platform for the presentation of the right image of the country, if we use the terms used by the organizers, is so much embedded in our culture that it even emerges in the popular films. And I would love to talk today about the story of this perception of this stereotype. We have to understand that it's not always been this way.
На чем она, собственно, основана? Во-первых, есть идея о спортсменах как послах культуры. Она на самом деле очень старая, и мы уже в XIX веке видим такие примеры. Скажем, американские бейсболисты, ездили по миру, пропагандируя таким образом американскую культуру. Мы очень много таких примеров знаем из советской истории. И, например, очень хорошо видно, что когда Советский Союз впервые начинает принимать участие в Олимпийских играх в 1952 году, очень видно по отчетам в зарубежной прессе, что люди смотрят на них, пытаясь понять, кто такие советские люди, какие они. И видно, что многие ожидали, поскольку это уже времена Холодной войны, многие ожидали от них какого-то напряженного или агрессивного поведения и приятно удивлялись, что они оказываются очень дружелюбными и очень милыми. В американской прессе это очень хорошо прослеживается.
This idea is based on the perception of sports people as ambassadors of culture, which is very old. It dates back to the 19th century when the US basketball players were traveling all around the world presenting the image of their country and the culture of their country, which is part of the cultural propaganda. When the USSR started to take part in the Olympics in 1952, we can trace the reports of the foreign media about the Soviet sportsmen. The journalists were trying to analyze their behavior, trying to understand what a Soviet person is. And since that was the time of the Cold War, they were expecting some aggressive behavior on their behalf, but they were gladly surprised to see nothing but friendship and friendly attitude.
Да, второй тезис — Олимпийские игры как способ направить современный национализм в мирное русло. Это на самом деле цитата канадского политика Майкла Игнатьева. Я согласна с этим определением. Это то, за что критикуют современные Олимпийские игры очень много. Я не буду говорить подробно об этом, но мы также должны иметь эту особенность, безусловно, в виду.
The second argument is that the Olympic Games in the 21st century is the way to channel the contemporary nationalism into the peaceful way. And this is actually a quotation from the Canadian Ignatieff, Mr. Ignatieff. I'm not going to focus on this aspect, but I thought it was important to mention it to you.
It's a problem. Да, и немножечко, очень кратко, я вынуждена порезать из-за необходимости перевода свою презентацию, немножечко о том, что привлечение этих самых мастеров искусств имеет очень долгую историю в олимпийском движении. В частности, один из самых интересных примеров — это существование Olympic Art Competition, так называемых, когда вручались медали в таких категориях, как архитектура, живопись или, скажем, поэзия. И среди призеров этих соревнований есть очень известные имена. Например, Фуджита, известный франко-японский художник, был бронзовым призером в 1936 году в категории «Живопись». Или, например, известный архитектор Ян Вилс был олимпийским чемпионом по архитектуре в 1928 году.
Actually, engaging creative professionals in the Olympics has a long-standing history. A curious example is that there was the Olympic art competition that awarded medals for the achievements in architecture, painting, or poetry. And there are some outstanding names here. For example, Fujita, the French-Japanese painter, in 1936 was awarded the bronze medal for painting, or Jan Wells was awarded the architecture medal in 1928.
И у меня совсем коротко два кейса, где вот эта самая презентация образа страны, да, проявляется сейчас наиболее ярко. Первая – это церемония открытия Олимпийских игр, и вторая – это парадная олимпийская униформа. На этом слайде вы можете увидеть, как менялась концепция олимпийских церемоний открытия, а поменялась она на самом деле довольно существенно.
And two cases that I'd love to briefly analyze in the respect of the presentation of the image of the country are the opening ceremonies. And here you can see how their concept changed, and it has changed quite radically, and the Olympic uniform, the official uniform.
Сегодня олимпийская церемония открытия – это большое театрализованное действие, которое длится примерно 4 часа, да, sorry, I'm running out of time, где есть протокольные части, есть так называемые артистические интерлюдии. Главная тема артистических интерлюдий – рассказать историю страны и показать ее богатство, ее культуры.
The opening ceremony now is a theatrical event that lasts 4 hours and that consists of some of the protocol activities and the so-called artistic interludes that are aiming to present the history and the richness of the country.
И сегодня для нас это очень привычный формат, на самом деле так было не всегда. Вот это расписание олимпийских церемоний открытия Олимпийских игр 60-го года, и мы увидим, что здесь нет никаких артистических интерлюдий в современном понимании этого слова.
Today we are really used to this kind of agenda, but this is the plan from the 1960s, and we can see non-artistic interludes here.
Вот главный спецэффект, который был в этих церемониях раннего типа, это выпуск живых голубей.
The special effect that existed in these early ceremonies were just the alive doves that were left to fly.
Но в конце 60-х меняется сама концепция. Если раньше это должно было быть торжественным ритуалом, то теперь это должно быть веселым спектаклем. И это прослеживается очень хорошо по официальным отчетам, например, организаторов Олимпийских игр. И появляются те самые артистические интерлюдии, темы которых берется из фольклорной культуры чаще всего.
In the 60s, the concept changes from the more official rituals to a performative event, and we can trace this change in the official reports. And it is at this time that the artistic interludes appear, mostly based on folk arts.
И, конечно, современные, вы представляете себе, да, это шоу, которое ставится для телевидения прежде всего, при этом это спектакль живой, и это приводит иногда к таким интересным особенностям. Иногда аудитория на стадионе видит не совсем то же самое, что видит аудитория по телевизору. Пример с Сочи и снежинкой, не раскрывшейся, которая на самом деле по телевизору раскрылась, вы наверняка помните.
The contemporary show is staged for the TV cameras for the most part, but it's also a live performance. And as you probably know, the stadium audiences see a different picture than the broadcast audiences. The notorious example here is the snowflake at the Sochi Olympic Games opening ceremony that didn't open for the audiences present there at the stadium.
И самое важное, что нужно знать про эти артистические интерлюдии, их содержание определяет оргкомитет. И поэтому это очень интересно смотреть, что страна выбрала для того, чтобы показать международной аудитории. Это пример Сочи, когда все очень позитивно отреагировали на включение вот этой части про авангард, про искусство авангарда. Правда, на судьбу памятников авангарда, например, это не то, чтобы сказалось положительно, к сожалению, нет. Они их продолжили разрушать довольно активно, но тем не менее.
The artistic interludes and their content has to be approved by the country's committee, and it's very interesting to see what the country chooses to present itself to the world. This is a notorious example also from the Sochi when the avant-garde, the Soviet avant-garde was used, and it was received extremely positively. Unfortunately, it didn't influence the sad demolition of the heritage sites in the avant-garde style, constructivism sites.
И второй тезис, который важен про артистические интерлюдии, это идея привлекать мастеров культуры из этой страны, именитых мастеров культуры, не умерла, она переродилось таким образом. Например, если в стране есть знаменитый режиссер, то его, скорее всего, позовут ставить церемонию открытия, как это было в Пекине с Джаном Эмоу или в Лондоне с Дэнни Бойлом.
The second important argument that the tradition of engaging the masters of art is still alive, for example, for staging the opening ceremonies, the most prominent directors, theatre directors or cinema directors, engaged, like Danny Boyle in London.
Да, я совсем сокращу, к сожалению, свою часть про парадную олимпийскую униформу. Это такой специальный вид костюма, который используется прежде всего для церемонии открытия, иногда для церемонии закрытия, но чаще всего сегодня нет. И самое важное про этот костюм, что нужно понимать, он имеет свою художественную программу, он создается с определенной целью, и главная задача, главная его функция на сегодня – это продемонстрировать национальную принадлежность делегации, которая носит. Но формы, как вы понимаете, демонстрации могут быть самые разные.
Sadly, I will have to really cut the section about the official uniform. This is a special costume created for the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony. And it has a certain artistic program and certain goals, and the main function of it being the broadcast of the national identity of its bearers.
На самом деле у этого костюма несколько функций, но это то, что Богатырев назвал появлением доминирующей функции костюма, да, который подчиняет к себе все остальные. И сейчас олимпийскую форму рассматривают прежде всего с той точки зрения, удачно или неудачно она выражает вот эту национальную принадлежность.
Actually, the Olympic uniform has a few functions, but the national identity is what Bogatyrov called to be the dominating function. Nowadays, all the uniforms are judged only from this point of view.
И буквально очень коротко 3 тезиса. Это тоже было не всегда, как и с олимпийскими церемониями. Например, в ранних примерах мы видим, что нет никакой визуализации национального в парадной олимпийской униформе.
Again, it's not always been like that. The early examples does not include any national identity.
А сегодня, наоборот, дизайнеры, которые работают над олимпийской униформой, решают проблемы, похожие на те, которые решает, в принципе, модная индустрия, да, что такое национальное в дизайне.
And the Olympic designers nowadays have to solve the same issues that all of the creative designers face. What is the national identity in dress and costume?
Это то, что я называю аналогом национальной одежды. Да, это не обязательно фольклорные или этнические мотивы. Это некий предмет, который может восприниматься в стране как аналог национальной одежды, например, как шорты для государства Бермуды. И второй важный момент, здесь тоже не умерла эта идея привлекать мастеров искусства из своей страны. Сейчас очень популярно, когда дизайнером становится ваш модельер, да, свой модельер, модельер той же национальности, что и делегация. Это дочь Боба Марли, которая делала униформу для делегации Ямайки. У нас есть такие примеры с Францией. Или если нет одного дизайнера с именем, то хотя бы бренд свой национальный должен быть.
This is what I call the national clothes. By that, I don't mean any folk or ethnic motives. It's just a broadcasting of national identity. Another thing that for the Olympic uniform, also the local, the national specialists are used, the national designers. We have such examples for Jamaica and France and other countries. If there is no prominent designer in the country belonging to the same nation as the team, then the brand is used, which has to be local.
И еще одна важная тема, про которую у нас, к сожалению, нет времени поговорить, это представление о других, которые мы также можем найти в парадной униформе. Так реализуется функция тематического костюма. И здесь, например, это церемония открытия игр в Пекине. Мы видим мотивы азиатского костюма в униформе Канады и в униформе сборной Франции. И это тоже очень интересно, какие стереотипные представления о костюме других стран и о культуре других стран существуют по всему миру.
Another important topic here is the perception of others, which is also shown manifested in the Olympic costume. This is what we call the thematic costume function. This is an example from Beijing, where the Asian motifs are seen in the uniforms of Canada and France. And it's also very interesting to analyze the stereotypes that exist about other countries.
Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for my timing.
Ekaterina, why do you think that the ceremony of the
Closing ceremony, you mean?
closing ceremonies are now not that popular, or then just not?
No,
they just don't exist.
No, I'm not thinking that it's less popular or anything like that. The case is just I need to choose cases for very short presentations. That's why I decided to speak only about opening ceremony, or not about all Olympic ceremonies.
Okay, but you mentioned that they don't exist mostly nowadays, the closing ceremonies, that they are less and less, no?
No.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood, sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you for your speaking.
I hope I didn't mention that. No, I didn't mean it. I speak about uniform for Olympic ceremonies, and now there is mostly there is two different type of parade uniform, one for Olympic opening ceremony and another one for Olympic closing ceremony. It's just two different costumes, literally.
Thank you. Any more questions? Remarks? Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Thank you.
In Aalborg University from Denmark. And my presentation is part of larger research, and this is the first time I'm talking about this study, so any critique is highly appreciated. This is a test drive, so to say. And I'm going to talk about wearables and how they might be commercialized today. And unfortunately, my slides are in Russian. So what a wearable is. Basically, this is technology that we can wear, and probably smartwatch and smart ring or fitness trackers are the most common things most of us are familiar with. But there is actually a lot of interesting research and a lot of prototypes not familiar for larger public. For instance, this is the same dress. It is called intimacy dress, which gets transparent when its carrier kind of gets sexually involved or excited. This jacket can navigate you through Paris, for instance, so it kind of acts as a navigator and gives you different signals where to turn left or right. This is a massage dress, smart boots that can kind of gets information about your physical conditions, and it also gives recommendation on physical activity and so on. And this is an interesting project from Durex. This is called Funderwear, or underwear for couples in long-distance relationship. And there is also a mobile application, and you can kind of imitate touching of your lover. But I'm not going to talk so much about characteristics of these things, but rather about practices in which they are incorporated. So what is practice? Practice is kind of different theories that are focused on our daily lives. What we are doing in our daily life, our routine activities, our purposeful activities. And this is a type of routinized behavior that consists of different elements. And actually there is no agreement on the list of elements, but I'm going to adopt theory offered by Elizabeth Schoff and Mika Panzar. So according to this theory, there are three things in order for practice to be crystallized. So materials, tangible objects, competences, skills we possess as carriers of practice, and meanings. So in order practice to crystallize, we should actually make sense of it. For instance, take showering. In order to take shower, we have to have a shower or a bath, pipes for water to run. Then we have to know how to, I don't know, turn the tap on. But also, we should possess some kind of understanding. Why is it important to take a shower? So basically, in addition to these three elements, there should be links between them. And there are three options. So this is the first one, innovation in waiting or proto-practice when there are elements but no links between them. Then crystallized practice with the three elements and links, and then proto-practice, or the practice of fossilified practice that does not exist anymore. And in my research, this is a very useful picture, since I'm going to have 3 case studies for each of the cases. And it is based on my interviews with designers and engineers from different countries. All of them have kind of a prototype. Everyone has a prototype of some wearable, and they're trying to start to produce them on a larger basis. So this is basically their interpretation. The first one case from Russia, an engineer that works in a prominent Russian university, and she has a prototype of a smart thing useful for disabled people. This is a student project, and let's have a look at her elements. So the first one, the materials. So basically she's looking for finances, for investors, and there are three options. The first one, state money, but unfortunately she explains that this is a very long procedure, and when you actually get money, the idea is so outdated that it makes no sense to continue with this. The second one is business, but there is a quotation when she says that everyone wants to get something for free. So they're kind of interested, but they're not eager to pay the engineers. And the last one, Russian NGO, and actually this was a very bad experience. Evgenia tells that they were acting as agents, but basically they just took their idea and started to travel around offering the idea to the companies, but with no guarantee of any property right agreement or whatever. So the next one is skills. So she's in a very fortunate position since she combines different educations. She's an engineer, which is quite useful and beneficial when you're working with these technical devices. But also she coordinates different students, so she can kind of benefit from their skills and use them in her team to develop these smart clothes. And finally, meaning. She tells directly that she wants to get money, she wants to kind of get some financial opportunity to basically to earn money. And she says that she doesn't care who finally buys this project as long as they pay. Therefore, we see that there are different elements, but no links between them, and we may kind of reflect upon why this happens, probably because Russian market is not formalized, and there are no rules of, say, no law on intellectual property rights, which makes it quite complicated. Plus, there is no professional community where people are eager to share their ideas. They feel very protective and jealous when somebody else is kind of becomes involved. The second case is actually a crystallized practice. Marina is a designer from the Netherlands. She has her own startup, and she usually gets projects from larger industries, from companies such as Philips. So material thing, she gets money from business as a rule. Some company comes with an idea and she makes a prototype. Then she also gets funding from different supranational, such as European Union organizations. And this is interesting because then she works with the same companies, but she kind of, their roles are twisted. So now she's a coordinator, she kind of dictates the rule. And finally, she also has self-finance project when there is quite a risky idea, but she wants to test it. And then kind of gives an example to the whole industry that, look, I'm kind of trying this new thing and it works, so you can also come into play. So she's very skilled. She's a collaborative designer, which means she looks beyond her own industry or design sphere, and she has a very strong reputation. So she tells that 90% of my tasks come from the industry, just through networking, because I have such good reputation. And finally, she says that I want to be serviceable. This is about the meaning, to be serviceable, just to mediate between different players on the market, and this is my task. So this is a crystallized practice. We see that there is a community, people with reputation, people who are eager to share their ideas, plus there are several strong players, such as Philips, on the market, so they can actually kind of act as a locomotive. So the last example, this is a fossilified practice. It doesn't exist anymore. Emmy, she's a designer from Finland, and she used to have quite successful startup, and they developed a very interesting wearable, but it didn't come up, so it doesn't exist anymore, and it's interesting to see why. So to begin with the materials, they were quite lucky to get funding from the very beginning. So they kind of paid salaries to themselves and were able to concentrate full-time on their project. And they also were quite successful in crowdfunding campaign. And here in her quotation, she explained that there is no button just to press and then people come and start buying your variable. No, 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 you have to very routinely work on this project on the daily basis. Then her skills, she's a textile designer, and in Finland, user-centered design is quite a popular thing. So they did testing and they got a lot of critique and feedback. And actually they changed the initial design just in order to satisfy their potential customers. Plus they were very skillful with Facebook, so they managed to get a lot of followers. But at some point they had to scale their business. And this was period when they actually understood that no, we have no skill to scale it up. This was the problem. And actually, this is a problem that they could overcome by, say, outsourcing someone or learning new skills. But concerning just looking at the meaning, she was always, in her narrative, she was always comparing this entrepreneur position with PhD or researcher position. And she was stating that when you are an entrepreneur or a businessman, you have to make it right away with all the things in hand. Whereas when you are a PhD student or a researcher, you have that much freedom, and I like it, and I want to go back to my roots. So in this case, it didn't work out just because it made no sense to her. She wanted to be a researcher. So sometimes it's not enough to possess enough money and skills. You should also kind of make sense out of it. And this is the final slide to take home. So the question I'm kind of trying to solve, and this is what a lot of designers and engineers ask. So what is the variable? Should we sell it as clothes or should we sell it as electronics? And this is kind of a puzzle, and I would be happy to hear any opinion or ideas on this. And I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any comments, questions, remarks?
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder, well, maybe it's the issue of presentation, not the issue of your research, but I wonder how the context of each case influences meanings, practices, and so on, because it seems like entrepreneurs work in different situations, and these different situations.
Probably I wasn't very vocal because actually in practice theory, practice and time played quite a crucial role. And when I was talking about the market in Russia, that it's not kind of formalized and there is no law, this was context actually. Compared to Holland, where there are larger players as Philips, this is also context. And I could of course reflect upon the meaning and context, but this is about ethical things and I'm probably not ready to reflect upon this at the moment.
Thank you. Any more questions? No questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daria. Now I want to thank you all.